I am to be the last Viceroy of India, and I shall carry out the role with great pride.
You're giving a nation back to its people. How bad can it be?
You're the future.
We are.
Then let's not make a mess of it.
Jeet Kumar, sir.
He's the new boy. We have something in common there.
You think India is ready to rule itself?
We've learned from the best.
From now on, there'll be more Indians of all faiths round our table. We can change a lot, and we absolutely have to.
You'll wear yourself out.
I mean, I'll wear you out.
300 million Hindus and Sikhs want a united India. 100 million Muslims do not.
You dance with your own kind.
My own kind.
Have some respect.
New nations are rarely born in peace.
It's got to be a clean cut. It's a bloody axe cleaving right through people's lives.
Well, whatever their differences are, all Indians have one thing in common.
What's that?
They can't wait to get rid of us.
Your father taught me the future is what we make it.
We are brothers with one soul. To divide us on religious grounds is against the will of God.
Without peace, all other dreams vanish and are reduced to ashes.
India is a ship on fire.
I don't know what to do. We belong together.
You have used me and my family.
We came to give India back her freedom, not to tear her apart.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for bringing the English weather to
We brought it
to New York.
We brought it. We wanted you to
It's
feel
like
at
being in
home.
London.
Exactly. I imagine that this, getting this movie made and making this movie was a bit of a long journey, as it usually is with historical dramas. I could be wrong.
Yes.
When did it start?
Well,
Yes, I am wrong?
no, you're right. When we started making the film, we started writing the script, Obama was president. There was no Syrian refugee
Still
crisis.
is in my mind.
And there was no Brexit. So it was 7 years ago when we started. And over the course of this, writing the script and making the movie, the whole world has changed. But the lessons of the movie, if you like, the lessons of partition, even though it was 70 years ago, are terribly resonant, I think, for today, and particularly today's world.
How so?
Well, the film is about what happens when people use kind of hate and division, to create disenchantment and violence, really, between people, and the lessons of where that can lead to, if we're not all aware that we're being played, basically. And I think that we're much more aware now of geopolitics, but back then, 70 years ago, the culture was such that people kind of generally accepted the ruler's point of view, of history, of politics, of what was supposed to happen, and not questioning things. And the film sets out to challenge the empire, the British Empire version of history at the end of the British rule in India.
One of the things that I thought was incredible in the film was the perspective of those who could potentially have power post-British rule, and what their perspective on it was. Don't push too hard because we don't want to lose our place in line if the line changes. I thought that was so fascinating.
Well, I think it was a very tricky time because the war, we just finished World War II, and the whole map of the world was a mess. There'd been allies, there'd been enemies, and I think that people in America and England and Europe were very worried about what was going to happen in Asia, particularly after the war, because the Soviets had announced Soviet expansionism, and so they potentially were going to take over the whole of Asia. At the same time, Britain had promised to hand India back for supporting the Allies during the war, but now, when push came to shove, it was time to hand India back. both Britain and America were nervous about what was going to happen in Asia if they did hand India back. So that was the sort of context then, and some of the troubles that we see in that part of the world today do have their roots in partition.
How hard was it for you to craft a love story, but also not just the love story, but the emotional story of the people working on the geopolitics of the situation, to create an emotional story with all of this factual background, to sort of break through it and make sure that you still had a visceral story for the audience to engage
Well, it's
in?
a very personal film. You know, it's my own personal family story. Partition was the largest forced migration in human history. 14 million people became refugees overnight, including my family. Growing up in England, I was always aware that I never had an ancestral homeland because my homeland had become this other new country called Pakistan. So I never had a kind of, you know, my grandfather or great-grandfather's sort of homes to go to. So I think that because there is that personal element, you know, you get the kind of emotional story through that. And also, I wanted to make sure it was a film that was also entertaining, you know, as well as informative. And I wanted to, this is my opportunity to do a big epic period drama. And I grew up loving the films of David Lean, you know, Merchant Ivory, these gorgeous big British films, Richard Attenborough, you know. And so here was my opportunity to make a big British costume drama.
Much more difficult to get those made now.
Yeah, really. That's why it took 7 years. Yeah, it's very hard. And it's very rare for someone like me, with my background, a British Asian female, you know, to get a film made where I talk about my own history in my own words. That's even rarer and harder to get off the ground.
You have one of the most successful films ever made by an Indian woman in the box office, right? Or maybe Bend It Like Beckham. Yeah. And do you still find that you run up against certain types of opposition based off of your ethnicity or your gender when you're trying to get something like this off the ground?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, people see me as a very successful British film director, and I have been financially made a lot more money than a lot of other British filmmakers. But, you know, every time I want to make a movie, if I want to make it from my particular cultural point of view and have a cast of people of colour, yeah, it's always hard. It's always like I'm having to reinvent the wheel. Even though my films have made a lot of money at the box office, there's always this perception that if you put a person of colour in a movie, suddenly it becomes niche. Suddenly people who are not of that background won't really want to see the film, and the whole market starts closing down on you. So really, for someone like me to get movies made is an absolute miracle, you know, in our industry.
You get questions like, are you sure you don't want Colin Firth to play Gandhi?
It's Ben Kingsley. Well, I think that, you know, you know, we are an industry as well, you know, at the end of the day. So one has to look at, you know, how can we make our films work financially as well as creatively.
That's it. They have to carve a path to make sure that the financial option is even out there. The fear is because the path hasn't been carved.
Exactly. I mean, you know, there's a fantastic quote from Emerson, American, right, who said, "Don't follow the path. You know, create a new path." And let others follow. And I feel that I'm always doing that, like always sort of pushing the envelope, always trying to get a film off the ground that shows different kinds of people. I mean, it's very rare for us to see Indian characters in a period film, in a period British film. It's very rare. So I think that that seems to be my task in life, is to always try and push that envelope. And, you know, I'm quite tenacious as a person. I mean, the same with Bend It Like Beckham, you know, that got rejected by everybody. Nobody wanted to make that film. And I was on the point of giving up making films, actually. And then I had one massive row with somebody. And so I managed to get some government finance. And then that's why that film happened. But had I not gone out and done that, it would never have happened.
What were some of the excuses you heard for not making Bend It Like Beckham?
no one wants to see a film about an Indian girl who wants to play football.
People said that out loud.
Oh, yeah. And where will you ever find an Indian girl who can bend a ball like David Beckham? Yeah.
Audible gasp.
Audible girl, but it's true. And my response was, do people think Harrison Ford jumps out of helicopters? You know?
Hell yeah. No,
Yeah.
sorry.
So that's what you're up against. I mean, I just think it's you know, I don't think people are out there saying, you know, we don't want to make films with people of colour, you know, we're racist, we're this, but it's not like that. I think it's just that there are more hoops and hurdles that we have to jump over to prove that there is a reason to make films from a particular cultural point of view. And that feels sad to me, particularly when you see how films do perform at the box office and critically, and that there is an audience, you know, for films. And I think what we'll find is people like Netflix and Amazon, you know, and we're seeing this already, you know, they will come in and pick up there, and they will want to work with people like me, and that's where we'll end up going, is telling our stories there on those platforms as opposed to in the cinema.
It goes back to that path, you know. A new path, sorry.
Path, yes.
Sir, you get the chance to play the first Prime Minister of India in this film.
That's right, yeah. That was...
terrifying was that to dive into? It seems like a big responsibility.
It was pretty terrifying. But Gurinder rang me up because this is the third film I've done with you, and the very first film was a film called Barge on the Beach, and I had a small part in Bend It Like Beckham. But Gurinder rang me up and she said, "I'm looking for Nehru. I'm looking in India. You know, you're under pressure to cast in India," which is quite right. She rang me up at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I was asleep. She was in Mumbai. I was in London. And she said, "I'm looking for a Nehru." And then she said, "Oddly enough, you look a bit like him." And I kind of went,
well, when
you're
you're casting leaders who are revered, you know, around the world, particularly in India, it was very important that you cast people who resemble. I think that you resemble them. And with Tanveer, I think he looks incredibly like Nehru did at that age.
And the same age. I mean, I'm the same age as he was when he was, you know, when in this film, you know, 57.
When I pulled up the Wikipedia photo, I was well, it looks exactly like him.
It's very weird, yeah. You know, but then it's great, you know, and so, you know, I said, of course, you know, I said yes without even reading the script. But I mean, you know, it was we flew out there and spent a month filming in Jodhpur in this amazing palace. It was wonderful. It was a great experience for me.
What kind of research did you have to do about Nehru, like how he talked or anything?
How he talked, tapes of him. There's an album on Apple. Should I use that word? Of all of his speeches. You know, there's about 7 or 8 speeches of his. You know, so listening to that, listening to the album, talking to people, looking at stuff online on YouTube and stuff, reading about him. You know. And that's as much as you can do, really, as an actor. And then, of course, you know, it's down to the lighting, the costume, and the slight resemblance. That helps.
Did you meet with any of his... Does he have any living family? Did you guys meet with any of sort of living family members of who you were...
Not Nehru, no. We did Mountbatten. Yeah. Mountbatten's daughter, Pamela Mountbatten, played by Lily Kilvert. And she's alive, and we had lunch with her a few times, and Hugh Bonneville came and met her as well at her house. And we had met people... I had met Mountbatten's ADC at the time. He told me what a vain man he was and how he was always concerned that his medals were beautifully polished and his official outfits were always sort of beautifully pressed, and he was very vain. And we also met a young... Pamela Mountbatten introduced us to a lady called Chadha Tanveer, who was... who actually lives in America now, and she was... Pamela Mountbatten's translator come friend, in Viceroy's house at that time. So we kind of had the actress Huma Qureshi, who plays Alia, meet with her, talk to her, and she again had this very posh English accent, although she was Indian. And so we were very lucky to meet people who were actually there at the time.
When in the writing process, you said about 7 years ago you started writing it, right? When in the writing process did you sort of come up with the idea to not just have it take place with the people making the decisions upstairs, but talk about the servants and how these decisions were affecting them? Because it is such a brilliant but like simple idea as a way to sort of cover these two landscapes.
Well, that was always the conceit from the beginning, because I wanted to tell the story of the ordinary people, but I knew I had to tell the story of the big people in order to get the ordinary people. And so by doing the upstairs-downstairs genre, I was able to talk about the politics, upstairs, and then the kind of emotional impact of those negotiations upstairs on the ordinary people. So that was always there from the beginning. What was interesting was that when we started off on the script with a book called Freedom at Midnight, which is, for many people, the sort of seminal book on partition, written by Larry Collins and Dominic Lapierre. It was written in the 70s, based on long interviews with Mountbatten. And we had optioned that book. And then about 2 years into writing the script, I was at a reception in St. James's Palace with Prince Charles. And
Look at you.
And I said to Prince Charles, I'm writing a script about your favourite uncle. And of course, Mountbatten was his favourite uncle. And he immediately, said, what are you basing it on? And I told him, and he said, please look at this other text as well. And I hadn't heard of this other book. And he pointed us in the direction of this book, Shadow of the Great Game, which was written by Gurinder Sarila, who was ADC to Mountbatten, assistant to Mountbatten in 1948 after partition. But Gurinder was an ex-ambassador, Indian ambassador to France for 20 years. He was now retired, and he was in the British Library in 1997. And he was writing a book on the Maharajas of India. And one day, he'd been going in for 2 months, one day this librarian was handed a box of top secret documents that were now coming into public domain, documents about India, because of course it was 97, so 50 years had passed. And this librarian happened to be Indian. Her name was Mrs. Ghosh. And she looked at the documents and realized the sort of sensitive nature of them, because they were basically discussing, what would be the future of India and the Indian Ocean and the region if Britain were to hand India back, So she brought the documents over to Narendra. Him being a diplomat understood their worth, and he ditched the book he was writing and then wrote the second book that our film is based on. So he really interrogated these top secret documents. They show up in the film. And these documents, I feel, give a very different version of history to what I had grown up with in Britain, i.e. the British Empire version of what happened at the end of British rule in India. So finally, I feel, after 70 years, I've been able to tell a different history. And part of that comes from the fact that growing up, my mother, who's 91 now, my mother, who had grown up in Rawalpindi, which is now Pakistan, she'd always maintained that everybody lived very happily side by side. Everybody lived respecting each other. When it was the Muslim celebration of Eid, they would give sweets to everybody in the town. When it was the Sikh festival of Gurpurab, everyone gave sweets to everyone. When it was Diwali, everybody celebrated. And she said everybody was connected because they were all against the British, so they were united in that. But secondly, they all respected each other because they had faith. They might be worshipping different gods in different temples and mosques and churches and whatever, but there was a force that connected them because of faith. And she says that in 1947, she doesn't know what happened. No one knew. It was like all of a sudden someone had come in and done black magic on everybody, and everything got destroyed, everything changed. And she said she always knew, everyone knew that it was something to do with the British, but no one could actually put their finger on it. So finally, when I finished the film and I showed my mum the film, I said, "Mum, you were absolutely right, and this is what it was."
Unbelievable. The British essentially started sowing divisions amongst everybody.
Well, that's always been the best policy of ruling people, is always to divide them, divide and rule, and the British were very good at that. And that's how they had an empire for so long. But I think that, the sad thing, I think, with partition was that there was not really any concern for the loss of life in following particular policies, that were in the interest of Britain and America at the time. And for me, the story was about what happened to my grandmother and the child that she lost, during the whole period. And so I was looking at it from that perspective as opposed to a leader's perspective, And I think that's what makes the film different to other sort of historical films.
Absolutely. You get a sense of the personal is political, or vice versa, as you're nearing the end of the film, and you're seeing people sort of being torn apart from their families and where they're from. But then the final moments where we realize it's your family's story. It is a really incredible moment. It's very surprising, and rarely does a filmmaker, even when it's a personal story, do they have the courage to kind of bring that forward.
Well, thank you. I mean, I do feel that, I knew I was taking on quite a hefty subject, and I knew that it was, a sensitive subject for a lot of people, because a lot of people were quite damaged, by the events of 1947. I was also aware that there are younger British people who also, want to learn about these events, and are ready to understand them from a different perspective. And, we live in a very multicultural country. Britain is incredibly diverse, and the end result of the diversity comes from the empire. That's why it's such a diverse country. And so I did want to make a film that also felt quite modern. It would have been easy for me to make an angry film and point fingers, and say, you did this and you did that. But I felt that was not the film that I wanted to make at this particular time, because I wanted the film to have resonance for today. And, it's the old cliche, hate versus hate, doesn't, is not the way forward. You've got to find a different way. We can't live with hate.
We like to say love trumps hate here.
I like
quite right.
Let's get some questions from the audience. Who's it right here?
Hi, thanks for being here. So I, being a huge Harry Potter fan, am very excited to see that Michael Gambon's part of this film. So I was curious, from a filmmaking standpoint and from an acting standpoint, what was it like working with him?
Well, Michael Gambon, of course, is a legend. And one of my big favorite films of Michael Gambon is The Insider, where I just think, my God, the way that he commands the screen, So I was frankly a bit intimidated, when he said yes, because he'd not been to India, and he was quite excited about being in the film. So my first sort of conversations with him were a little bit like, because the Harry Potter as well. But actually, he was an incredibly kind man, and he understood his character. He looked for the humanity in his character, Lord Ishmael, even though he's got some quite, unsavory elements, in the film. And I found that even though he's sort of, getting on in years, when he's on, he is on, What we realized was that he couldn't handle the heat very well, because it was hot. It was 40 degrees, and so we did have to sort of start working with him early in the morning when it was still quite cool, and once we did that, it was amazing. But he did find the heat slightly hot, but it was a pleasure working with him, and I'll always cherish that.
I've been working as an actor since 1981, and I'm a huge fan of his. Wanted to work with him, and I saw something really amazing. He's got this childlike quality. He's fun. He's welcoming. He's charming. He's lovely. But the minute he starts speaking, the minute he's on camera, everybody stops. You're kind of in awe. He just just nails it straight away. I mean, he's incredible. You know, he's charming and light, and then he just does it, and that's just class. You know, it's just, he was amazing. And then, of course, you know, and you look around, everybody's kind of going, oh my God, I've got to up my game here, you know, because he's just the best, you know. Amazing.
That's also a hard thing to do for an actor, that kind of turn it on, turn it off thing. And I think a lot of actors, I mean, because it takes a moment to get to a place and to find where you want to be, to sort of elicit the emotion that you're bringing to a scene. When an actor can kind of just do that, it's pretty mind-blowing.
He just has that. He just has that ability. You can just switch it on. I mean, it's just amazing. It's a confidence, and it's also not over-analyzing things. You know, just using your instinct and using your gut instinct and just doing the craft, as it were. You know, from a very simple level, and just doing it. You know, and not messing about. That's just great to see. I love that. It's very old school.
Next question.
Hi. So I'm from Pakistan, and my family, you know, had some stories about the partition, and have Indian friends whose family also had their own stories, and they're all different perspectives. I was wondering, like, how many stories did you have, or did you listen to, and was it hard? I know you had your own. Was it hard to show different perspectives in like one story?
Yeah, absolutely. I met and spoke to lots of different people from all sides. There's a very fantastic site called 1947 Archive, which started from Berkeley University. It's a charity which I'm now a patron of. And in that charity, they ask people from all walks of life, all corners of the world to talk about partition, and it's filmed, and so this is a record now, and anyone can access the site. And so there you have amazing stories from people from Pakistan, from India, from Bangladesh, and it's sad. I mean, today my cab driver, Mohammed, you know, I just started chatting to him, and he, you know, he's from New York, he lives in Brooklyn, and he was talking about his father, who was 3 at the time of partition. And I said, did your father ever talk about, you know, partition, or your grandfather, you know? And he said, yeah. And they talked about how they went from India, from Jalandhar to Pakistan in 47, and how they were all, it was a huge caravan of Muslims going. And then, because it was the monsoon season, the rivers were overflowing, and then somebody did something to one of the riverbanks, you know, and then suddenly a big flood came and swept loads of these refugees away. And he said that's what his father talks about, you know, as a child, remembering that. I mean, that happened to me this morning, you know, here in New York. So I tried to make a film that was as balanced as possible. I purposely didn't want to show violence. I didn't recreate violence. I didn't want to spend thousands of dollars, you know, recreating anything. If there was any shouting, I purposely made the people unrecognizable in terms of what background they were, you know. So you never knew if it was a Hindu or a Sikh or a Muslim. You never knew. You just saw humanity, really.
There were 1.3 million people were slaughtered. Which is something you forget, which is an enormous amount. But of course, you can't show that because it becomes a documentary, you know. And the facts are.
Well, I used archive footage. Actually, it was 1 million is the official.
Is it?
Yeah, 1 million's the official, but it's probably a lot more.
I think if that's the official, it's going to probably be a little bit more than that. Okay.
But I found the archive footage very powerful, and in the film, I've used quite a lot of archive footage, and there it's all kinds of refugees. There they are recognizable. You see the Sikhs, you see the Muslims, you see the Hindus in the actual archive footage, and I found that to be terribly moving. And ultimately, you know, I did not, for a time that was sort of very sad in terms of communal violence, the last thing I wanted to do was create a film that in any way condoned that, you know, and expressed that. And so that I was at great pains not to do that in my film. And I'm really grateful that in Britain, you know, a lot of British Pakistanis really appreciated the film, because they felt for the first time they understood their own history, you know, because it had been portrayed in a different way previously.
Talk about having the Lord and his wife, and covering that. They aren't necessarily, or they aren't at all white saviors for the people, but at the same time, they could play that role, or other movies would inadvertently, accidentally maybe have them play that role. Specifically not writing that and being aware of that cliche, even as they are ostensibly your leads in the film.
Well, I wanted to show that they were really lost at sea. You know, they were really there as patsies. The decisions had already been made, and really they were there as fall guys, you know. And Edwina was, I think, a lot more politically astute than her husband, and I think she realised something was not quite right, you know. But I don't think I think Mountbatten thought that he could use his charm, you know, to get all sides round a table and work this out, you know, where other politicians hadn't been able to. So I think he was a little green, you know. But I think that nobody at that time really realised what was going on behind the scenes, you know, and that there were other agendas afoot. And I think that Nehru and Gandhi, you know, Gandhi was very much hated by Churchill. He had all kinds of insults for him. And that was because Gandhi had sort of really single-handedly brought on the end of the British Empire, because by starting his Quit India movement, and then, of course, Congress and all the other people, Hindu, Muslim, Sikhs, who all sort of fought under that banner for freedom, once Britain knew that India would get their independence, then they knew all the other countries would follow suit, and that would be the end of empire. So I think Churchill sort of blamed Gandhi for the end of the British Empire, and but I don't think Gandhi and Nehru really understood just how politically important they were, and how strategically important India was in the bigger scheme of things, you know, because they were more looking inwards at their own country, whereas the British had been used to ruling the world, and they had a more global perspective. And that's when I come back to the geopolitics of the time. You know, I don't think that they really thought about the geopolitics of what was going on, or maybe never really, you know, I just don't think that they realised just how important India was strategically and militarily to the new superpowers and the coming of what was to be the Cold War.
I think we have time for one more question right here.
Hi, thank you for being here. The locations in the trailer just look so beautiful. I was wondering how you went about choosing where to film.
Well, we were very lucky because we actually shot in the real Viceroy's house, which is in Delhi, and it's the biggest palace actually where any political leader lives in the world. It's a huge palace, and we shot the exteriors there on the front lawn and in the back. And then we had another palace where we shot that was built sort of the same time in Jodhpur, which is the palace of the Maharaja of Jodhpur. And so we did a lot of our interiors there. And
which was, that was a 1/4 replica, wasn't it, of the original Viceroy's house? So it was a scaled down version of the original.
But they were fantastic buildings that gave us that sense of scale, you know, on the limited budget that we had. But interestingly, the thing about Viceroy's house is that it had only been finished 17 years before the end of British rule. So I think that when Lutyens, you know, was making the building, you know, he was the architect. I don't think he had any idea that it was going to be handed over to Indians only 17 years later. I mean, if you look at the building, I think it was built for at least another 300 years of British rule. So I think the building has quite a lot of it, you know, grandeur and irony itself.
When can people see the film?
So the film opens on Friday, 1st of September. A few cities first, and then it will open out. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it.
I hope they do too. I think they will. It's a beautiful film. Congratulations.
Thank you so much
for being here.